This is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support.
Hey, I'm Steve Mathis. Welcome to Tony Blazer's Motocross Vault.
Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazer, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at Kawasaki's all-new for 1988 KX250. Now, the first thing I want to mention is I do apologize for the quality of my voice a little bit. Spring is sprung here in, here in Virginia, and I am very, very congested. Unfortunately, spring kind of kicks my butt. My allergies go nuts for about a month here. And I've been pretty miserable for about a week now, and unfortunately it doesn't get better anytime soon, so I didn't want to keep waiting. I figured I'll medicate myself a little bit and try and push through here. So again, my sound of my voice is probably a little weird, but kind of stick with me through it. I appreciate it. Now, Kawasaki in 1988 came out with an all-new KX250. It was very different than the 87. The 87 had actually been a very good bike. Had a really powerful tractor-style motor, ran the exact opposite of machines like the CR250, which were really a mid-range and up, kind of a pro-style engine. A lot of people loved it. Really, the thing that torpedoed the KX in 87 was the fact that Kawasaki decided not to put cartridge forks on it. In 87, you had the RM and the CR with cartridge forks, and they pretty much waxed everybody. Both Yamaha and Kawasaki used the old damper rod travel control valve forks, and they were just junk. It didn't work very well, and it really hurt the KX in the final standings. For 88, they finally went with cartridge forks on the KX, completely redesigned the chassis, had an all-new motor with a more advanced KIPS valve in it. Really a complete redesign, and the bike could not have been more different in terms of the way it felt, because in 87 the KX was very slim, had a very narrow layout, by far the narrowest layout of any of the bikes in the class. I remember I rode the 87, I had a 125 and my buddy had the 250, and I was like, I loved how slim it was. But in 88 they went with a completely different, it was literally like twice the width. Apparently in 87, Ron Lachine and Jeff Ward and some of the guys that thought the bike was actually too narrow, found it hard to hold on to in the rough. I hated the 88. Another buddy of mine got the 88 when it came out, and I thought it was just really pudgy. And the motor was just so fast. I mean, it felt like to me, it felt like a 500. I was like, wow, this thing is really fast. And that 88 was a rocket ship of an engine. The suspension was much better. I never really liked the pudgy layout. I remember I ended up buying an 89 KX250. Still didn't really feel comfortable on the bike. But I know a lot of people loved it. I think I'm only 5'8". I think taller guys liked it better. My buddy Jamie Conrad has an 88 KX500 now. And when I ride it, actually, it doesn't bother me. But I remember back then, when I was a teenager, I thought it was, not a great layout. Again, maybe as you get older, you're not as worried by it. And it's funny, actually, a lot of modern bikes are actually thicker than the old bikes were. I remember when I had my 1990 CR250 a couple years ago, it was noticeably slimmer than my 2016 KTM. So it's like over time, layouts have changed. The bikes have become much more flat. The seats are much thinner, and then actually I think they're a little wider in places. But in any case, at the time, I thought it was the wrong move. I don't know that it really hurt the KX in terms of popularity. Again, a lot of people like this bike. Just wasn't really for me at the time. If you like this sort of thing, you can check out several of my other reviews. I have reviews of all kinds of classic motorcycles on the channel, ATVs, and even some enduro machines. I've done a history of like the KDX200, history of the CR250. I will be doing a history of the KX250 moving forward. So if you could like and subscribe and check out some of those videos, I'd appreciate it. If you'd like to support what I do have Motocross Vault merch available. I just came out with an all-new design based on one of the coolest bikes of the 70s, in my opinion, the 1978 Harley-Davidson MX250, a machine that was only made that 1 year. They did have an earlier version that was kind of a prototype, but really, as far as production goes, Harley kind of made a push in 78. The bike didn't take off. Clearly, it didn't work out, but I thought it was a great looking motorcycle, and I thought I'd make a neat shirt. So I did a version with just the bike, and also the bike in the back of a Chevy Love, which is a truck I had, actually technically my dad had when I was a kid, and I always thought it was a pretty cool truck. So if you want to check that out, there'll be a link in the description, and also a card here in the video. So here, without further ado, is a look back at the 1988 KX250. The mid to late 80s were a time of great success for Kawasaki. After languishing at the back of the motocross pack throughout most of the 70s, they came roaring back with a series of ever-improving machines during the Reagan decade. First in the 80 class, then later in the 125s and the 500s, the green machines went from also-rans to top contenders. In the 250 division, however, that success proved to be more elusive. Year in and year out, the KX250s had provided the power to win, without the handling and suspension finesse to take advantage of all those ponies. In 1987, that had once again been the KX250 story, as the Green Deuce and a Half pumped out tons of power, but was unfortunately saddled with a grim set of forks. With a tractor-like power band and the slimmest ergonomics in the class, the 1987 KX250 had its devotees, but its lack of a cartridge fork and rather pedestrian handling held it back from capturing the top spot in the 250 division. Fun, fast, and feathery feeling, it was highly competitive, but not quite up to toppling Honda's omnipotent CR250R. For 1988, Kawasaki set about finally capturing the mantle of the top 250 in the land by scrapping the 87 design and introducing a redesigned KX250. Considering the 87 model had been a total redesign as well, this was no small amount of effort by the Green team. In 1987, Kawasaki had finally moved away from their original dogbone-style Unitrack linkage on the KX and adopted a Honda-style Pro-Link bottom link design. This new layout lowered the center of gravity considerably and freed up room to enlarge the airbox for additional power. For 1988, Kawasaki kept this new layout and added several more chassis changes aimed at improving the KX's performance. Just as in 1987, the KX's frame was crafted out of tough chromoly steel, but the 1988 version featured substantial bracing in critical areas like the steering stem and the swing arm pivot. This was done to reduce flex and improve chassis precision. The overall geometry was also altered slightly, with the new frame employing slightly more trail than 1987. Mated to the new frame was a redesigned Unitrack linkage, which features new ratios to deliver a more progressive action. This new layout also moved the link arms up slightly to prevent them from catching on obstacles under full compression. To further improve handling, Kawasaki redesigned the rear swing arm for 1988 to be stronger overall and much more resistant to torsional flex under heavy loads. Both the height and width of the swing arm were increased, and an additional internal brace was added to beef up its construction. To prevent unwanted axle movement, the chain adjustment mechanism was also redesigned and moved to an internal configuration. Aiding the stopping duties for 1988 were all new brakes both front and rear. Changes to the rear were aimed at reducing the grabbiness of the powerful but light switch-like 87 binder. Up front, a revised master cylinder offered a new ratio for more power and a new shorty lever for increased comfort. In a weight and cost-cutting measure, the brake lines were changed to nylon from the braided steel of 1987. Finishing off the chassis changes for 88 were a redesigned alloy subframe, which could be removed to aid shock servicing, and a fresh coat of green paint, which replaced the silver of previous KX machines. On the suspension end of the equation, the 88 KX250 featured major upgrades both front and rear. In 1987, this had been the real weak link in an otherwise highly competitive package, and Kawasaki knew this shortcoming would need to be addressed if the KX was going to best its rivals. Starting in 1986, Honda had begun offering cartridge internals on their CR250 fork, and these work-style dampers had immediately rendered all other forks in the class obsolete. The cartridge design offered reduced aeration, improved damping control, and a wider range of operation over the older, damper rod-style designs. In 87, Kawasaki had resisted the move to the more sophisticated forks by trying to employ a less costly workaround. Their Kayaba travel control valve fork made lots of promises that its on-track performance could not back up, and both Yamaha and Kawasaki suffered in the 87 standings for it. In 1988, Kawasaki finally decided to get with the program by moving to a cartridge design on their KX250. All new for that season, these 43mm conventional Kayaba cartridge units pumped out 11.8 inches of travel and offered 16 positions for compression adjustability. This put it on par with the 43mm Showa units found on the 88 Honda, but still a tick behind the more sophisticated units employed on the 88 RM250, which offered rebound adjustments to go with its compression selector. In 1987, the KX250 shock had been more successful than its forks, but it still lagged behind the top performers in the class. It was slightly harsh in the mid-stroke and prone to bending shock shafts when ridden hard. For 1988, Kawasaki looked to address both of these issues by installing an all-new shock for the KX. To rectify the bending issues from 1987, Kawasaki's engineers upped the diameter of the shock shaft by 2 mm. This was the same 16 mm used by Jeff Ward on his factory machine in 87. In addition to the larger shaft, an all-new damping system was introduced to provide more consistent oil flow through the shim stack for a smoother feel. Rear-wheel travel remained at 13 inches, with 16 adjustments available for both compression and rebound control. On the motor side, Kawasaki once again went all in with a complete redesign of their 250 powerhouse. In 1987, the KX had offered a power band that pumped out tons of low to mid power. The super responsive motor jumped at the slightest crack of throttle and ran the exact opposite of Honda's Rev It to the Moon CR250. Many riders love this chunky style of power, but fast guys did lament its utter lack of top-end performance. For 1988, Kawasaki tried to extend the pull of their well-regarded mill by completely redesigning their Kawasaki Integrated Power Valve System, or KIPS. Originally introduced in 1985, the original KIPS consisted of two small subports and a small exhaust resonance chamber. At low RPM, the two subports closed and redirected the exhaust flow to the resonance chamber in the exact same manner as Honda's Automatic Torque Amplification Chamber, or ATAC. This boosted low-end performance by mimicking the effects of installing a torque pipe on the exhaust. As RPMs rose, a centrifugal ball governor opened the two subports and closed off the resonance chamber to increase exhaust flow for increased top-end performance. For 1988, Kawasaki looked to increase the KIPS effectiveness by adding a third mechanism to the design. In addition to the original subports and resonance chamber, a new variable exhaust valve was added to the main exhaust port. This new valve was designed to alter the port timing the same way as Yamaha's YPVS and Honda's HPP. In addition to the new KIPS mechanism, an all-new combustion chamber was designed that promised to provide a more uniform burn and a reduction in the infuriating plug fouling of 1987. One of the reasons for the KX's prodigious tractor-like power in 87 had been Kawasaki's move to a longer stroke, and the 88 machine maintained this long stroke configuration, but added a bit of weight to the crankshaft to increase the chug factor. Overall displacement remained unchanged at 249cc, but the 88 rendition did offer slightly lower compression than the year before. In addition to the new top end, the 88 KX featured an all-new intake system. A new airbox was installed that increased volume and added a trick set of rotating valves that could be opened or closed based on track conditions. The carburation duties were moved from the R-bottom McCuney carburetor of 1987 to a new Kaheen Crescent Slide PKW39 for 88. This new mixer was said to offer the most unobstructed airflow of any carburetor available at the time. This also allowed the pilot jet to be positioned more closely to the main jet for a smoother transition as you open the slide. Finally, a new 8-pedal carbon fiber reed valve was added to feed fuel to the cylinder. Matched to the new intake was a redesigned exhaust system that was tuned to improve top-end performance over the year before. On the bottom end, an all-new clutch was added that featured a redesigned engagement arm that repositioned the pivot points for smoother action. Both the pushrod and plates themselves were also modified to prevent sticking and ensure a smoother, more solid feel at the lever. If it did become necessary to swap out the plates, an all-new two-piece cover made servicing much faster and easier than in the past. Of all the changes made in 1988, perhaps the most dramatic was the layout of the machine. In 1987, the KX had been by far the slimmest bike in its class. Its bodywork was razor thin, and its ergonomics made it feel more like a 125 than a 250. While most riders loved the slim feel, some pros, notably Jeff Ward and Ron Lachine, had felt the midsection was too slim to get a good hold on in the rough. Off-roaders also lamented the half-gallon reduction in capacity the tank had suffered in the 87 transition. For 88, Kawasaki remedied both of these concerns by completely redesigning all the bodywork on the KX. A new tank was spec'd that provided 0.6 more gallons of capacity and increased the width of the machine considerably. New side plates were also installed that matched the beefier new profile, and a redesigned seat was added that offered a flatter and more squared-off shape. In the rear, a new fender was designed that carried up much higher towards the back of the seat. This was done to provide a smoother transition when sliding rearward, but it did give the fender a slightly odd appearance. On the track, the all-new KX250 turned out to be a very competitive 250 motocross weapon. The new motor accomplished all of Kawasaki's goals and turned out to be the best 250 engine available in 1988. The new heavier crank smoothed out the 87's abrupt low-end hit and made the KX much easier to control. Out of turns, it no longer tried to jerk your arms out of your sockets and hooked up much better on slippery surfaces. The mid-range was still extremely potent, however, and it was best to hold on tight once the bike came on the pipe. Once the power band kicked in, the KX pulled with such ferocity that many riders compared it to an open bike. On top end, the new motor pulled farther than before, but the majority of its thrust was still found in the mid-range. On the dyno, it pumped out nearly 2 more horsepower and 2 foot-pounds more torque than 87, but on the track, it felt like double that amount. It was a rompin', stompin' powerhouse of a motor that chugged, churned, and roosted its way to the front. In 1988, no other motor was even close to the big bore vibes put out by the KX. On the suspension front, the KX was much improved in some areas and a bit of a push in others. Up front, the new 43mm Kiava cartridge forks offered a much smoother ride than 87. They absorbed big hits well and tackled most track obstacles without a whimper. Both the spring rates and valving were well suited to most riders below the Pro class, and the bike could be raced with the forks in stock condition without any major issues. The only complaint with their operation was a hint of the old fork's harshness in the mid-stroke, But overall, it was rated the second best front end of 1988, behind only the excellent silverware found in the Suzuki RM250. In the rear, things were not quite as rosy, however. The all-new Unitrack rear suspension turned out to be a rather lackluster performer, with damping settings that held it back from performing its best. In the rough, it was harsh on compression and prone to packing up on successive hits. This gave it a dead feel, as it thudded into bumps instead of recocking before the next impact. It worked well on big hits, but small chatter and whoops played havoc with its overly aggressive damping settings. It was not unraceable, but it was far less plush than machines like the RM and Yamaha YZ. If you wanted to get the most out of your 88 KX250, a shock revalve was most definitely in order. On the handling front, the new KX was an excellent middle-of-the-road performer. The new stiffer chassis and revised geometry made the 88 KX the sharpest turning quacker of all time, but it was still not a carver by Honda standards. What it did do much better than the Honda was go straight, and the KX offered one of the best combinations of stability and agility in the class. Some riders did miss the old bike's super slim layout and commented that the pudgy ergos and monster motor made the KX feel more like a 500 than a lightweight 250. Of course, the additional 7 pounds the KX picked up for 88 did not help its Rubenesque feel. While this did not cripple its competitiveness on the track, it did make the KX more of a handful for smaller and lighter riders. The larger and taller you were, the more likely you were to jive with the KX250's new plus-size feel. On the detailing side, Kawasaki made solid strides in some areas and suffered from familiar foibles in others. The new airbox with the rotating air vents was super trick and made muddy races less of a worry. The new one-piece bar clamp prevented the bars from twisting in a crash and helped give the KX a more precise feel. The foot pegs were also larger for 88, and everyone enjoyed the increased support they afforded. Most riders loved the bike's new color scheme as well, with the green frame and silver motor. This was reminiscent of the super trick DMC Kawasaki machines of the time, and a welcome refresher from the often stodgy KX aesthetics. Other markets received blue side plates in 88, but for some reason Kawasaki decided to stick with green for all the KXs other than the 80 bound for the US. The redesigned clutch offered an easier pull at the lever, but the unit continued to offer a grabby engagement and subpar plate life. At least servicing it was easier with the new two-piece clutch cover. The new front brake offered lots of power, and most riders liked the new shorty lever, but many calipers suffered from sticking pistons. Honing out the piston cavity and keeping a close eye on the easily bent alloy caliper bracket were the best ways to prevent a possibly painful braking snafu. In the rear, the braking feel was much improved, with much less of the light switch engagement that had annoyed riders in 87. Off-roaders also loved the new larger tank, but no one cared much for the KX's incredibly brittle plastic. The fenders, shrouds, gas cap, and side plates were easily cracked and far less durable than the plastic found on any of the competition. Most bolts were also of the pot metal variety, with the ones used to secure the seat and subframe being the worst offenders. Speaking of the seat, this was probably the most universally panned part of the 88 makeover. While the shape was reasonably inoffensive, the loaf of Wonder Bread Kawasaki installed as seat foam was not. Even when new, it sagged appreciably and locked the rider in place. Once it was ridden on for a while, it immediately reverted to the consistency of a warm marshmallow and placed the rider's coccyx directly on the frame rails. If you were in favor of avoiding a bruised bum, then an aftermarket upgrade in the foam was a must. Lastly, the alloy subframe, while super light and trick, was also easily damaged and prone to stripping out the inserts that secured the seat. Adding a nut to the seat bolt and installing a frame guard to the left side strut to prevent the flimsy chain from chewing through it were a must. Overall, the 1988 KX250 turned out to be the most competitive green machine ever to grace the 250 class. It was big, burly, and slightly brittle, but also wickedly fast and good handling. The redesigned triple Kips motor was the class of the 250 field, and the new cartridge KYB forks finally brought the KX out of the suspension dark ages. If only it had offered a shock that worked well and a bit less weight, it might have captured Kawasaki its first shootout victory in the 250 division. In an era where slimmer, lighter, and smaller were all the rage, the 1988 KX250 went a different direction and left it up to you to decide what path led to the victory podium. So there you have it. That's a look back at the 1988 KX250. A machine that was really well liked in 88. Honda kind of stumbled after dominating in 86 and 87. Honda came out with the all-new lowboy layout, really trick machine. Loved the looks of the 88. Thought it was the coolest bike available, the Honda that year. But they kind of screwed up their suspension settings. The motor was very listless that year. It kind of took the hit away, and a lot of people did not care for it. So it really opened the door for Kawasaki to kind of weasel in there and finally get that top spot. But unfortunately, I think the bulky layout hurt it in some people's minds. The the bike was heavy. It really weighed much more than the others, and it felt even heavier than that just because of the layout. And I think that was enough to kind of hold it back in the final standings, even though in most ways it was a better bike. Motocross Action picked the Yamaha that year to be the best, and then a lot of the other magazines like the 88 RM better. So Kawasaki would still take a few years to finally get that top spot, but this 88 was definitely an improvement in most ways, and I think a lot of people think it's a pretty cool machine even today. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out the other stuff I've done on the channel. If you could like, subscribe, and share on social media, I would very much appreciate it. It definitely helps allow people to find the channel and allow people to find my content, and I do appreciate everybody's support. Until we meet again, this is Tony Blazer with Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.